G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with the second part of the book reading. Part 1 covered the acknowledgements and introduction as well as the prologue. We now take up the story again at page 18. Okay, the warning. On Wednesday, February 18, 1942, in that strange light that comes just before daybreak in the tropics, Charles Stewart was standing anchor watch on the troop ship Zealandia. The Zealandia, which before the war had been a coastal trader, had just returned from taking the first shipload of evacuees to the south, and she was riding gently at anchor in Darwin harbour. Stewart was looking out across the harbour, waiting for the first glow of dawn, when he saw two aircraft flying fairly high and showing navigation lights. At first he took little notice, and as there was a total blackout on the harbour, the thought of an attack never crossed his mind. And there were many flights, particularly by American float planes, ferrying personnel between Australia and the Dutch East Indies, which came and went under cover of darkness. There seemed nothing exceptional about these two, until he suddenly realised that there was something different. From the centre of the bluff behind him, someone was signalling, and clearly signalling to the aircraft. The planes were about 3 kilometres apart, and as Stewart watched, he saw the lights on one of them flash off and then quickly back on. This was repeated twice before both aircraft turned in a leisurely circle and flew back out to sea. Stewart logged the incident and thought no more about it until hours later. The aircraft flew northeast over Bathurst Island, extinguishing their navigation lights as soon as they were out of sight of any curious plane watcher in Darwin. An hour later, both pilots had landed safely on the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagai and were being debriefed by the commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant planner who had orchestrated the raid on Pearl Harbor 10 weeks earlier. The fifth columnist, probably a Chinese, who had operated freely in Darwin since the roundup of all Japanese nationals, had confirmed that the convoy had not slipped out quietly during the night and that no new reinforcements had been brought in. The last of the loose ends was now tied up, and everything was set for the raid on Darwin, which had actually been approved in principle immediately after Pearl Harbor. This was the first opportunity that the Japanese Navy had been given to mount it. The Akagai, flagship of the huge 16-ship fleet of Admiral Nagumo, 4 of them aircraft carriers, had steamed into the Timor Sea the previous day in preparation for the attack. The raid was to be led by one of Japan's outstanding pilots, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who, like Genda, had distinguished himself at Pearl Harbor, where he had led the level bombers into the attack. The Japanese had a predilection for overkill, wherever possible attacking with a much larger force than was strictly necessary. They reasoned that it reduced the margin for error, was an excellent morale booster for their own men, and put the fear of God into the enemy. That was certainly to be the case on this occasion. His strike force consisted of 81 level bombers, 71 dive bombers and 36 Zero fighters, 188 aircraft in all, which would be launched from the 4 carriers. A second strike would then follow, and this would consist of 54 land-based bombers, which would come from Ambon and Kendari in the Celebes. Compared with Pearl Harbor, the planning of the raid was not difficult for Genda. The Japanese were overwhelmingly stronger than they had no reason to expect more than token resistance from the machine gun emplacements around the town. They were also well informed about Darwin's defences and the precise locality of the key buildings which were to be destroyed. The information had been constantly updated and came from fifth column sources as well as from their own reconnaissance aircraft. Instructions to the carrier fleet, revealed in documents, show that the fleet was ordered to, quote, annihilate the enemy in strength in the Port Darwin area, unquote. But not all the Japanese commanders had agreed that this was the most efficient method of neutralising Northern Australia permanently. The staff of the Japanese combined fleet, for example, led by Admiral Yamamoto, believed that an ambitious landing and an invasion would be more effective. But the Naval General Staff, that's the people who look after the boats that supply the troops, and the Army, that's the people who supply the troops, disagreed. They reasoned that although the invasion would meet little opposition, it would tie up a large number of troops, who the Japanese didn't have because they were already bogged down all over the South Pacific, and 500,000 of them were stuck in China. to have a large number of troops to maintain the area and that heavy bombing would be equally effective. Yeah, and the Naval General Staff said that they didn't have the boats to conduct the invasion of Australia or to supply any troops after the invasion of Australia. So their big theory was to have bases that could bomb Darwin, but they never ever wanted to invade. The Australian public was never ever allowed to even consider that the Japanese had any plans other than immediate invasion. Soon after the reconnaissance pilots had been debriefed, the carriers began to launch their aircraft, some of the fighters climbing aloft to protect the more vulnerable level bombers and dive bombers. They took their places in the formation, and when Fuchida was satisfied, he turned them on course for Darwin. Local time in Darwin was then about 8:45, which meant they would be over the Australian coast at about 9:50. Their flight path took them directly over Bathurst Island, about 80 kilometres north-northwest of Darwin. On the far southeast corner of the island, the Catholic missionaries of the Sacred Heart Mission had started their day as usual, with the morning Angelus being rung at 6 o'clock. Then they had breakfast and allocated jobs for the day to many of the 300 Aborigines who lived on the station. At 20 to 9 by his clock, which was 20 to 10 by Darwin time, as they had put their clocks forward for summer time, Brother Francis Joseph Quinn turned over in his bed. He was not feeling well and had decided to stay where he was until his conscience or one of the other brothers made him get up. He had just glanced at the time when there was a sudden loud commotion among the tribesmen and women outside. The next moment, the mission priest, Father John McGrath, rushed past his door shouting something about the wireless station. In seconds, Brother Quinn was out of his bed and outside. He looked up and saw more aircraft than he had ever seen at one time in his life. Although they had silhouette charts, the aircraft were too far away to identify, but there was no doubt that the course on which they were set would bring them directly over Darwin in less than half an hour. A unique chain of civilian coast watchers, numbering more than 700 at the outbreak of war in 1939, watched over Australia's 20,000 kilometres of coastline, their duty being to report any unidentified movements of shipping or aircraft. They were issued with transceivers, often pedal operated, and they gave brave and invaluable service, particularly in the islands where they were almost invariably cruelly treated and executed by the Japanese if they were caught. The Bathurst Island Mission was one of these coast watching posts, and it reported to Darwin Radio. The coastal radio station, call sign VID, operated by AWA, or Amalgamated Wireless Australia. In addition to its primary role as a radio station for shipping, Darwin Radio maintained contact with isolated communities that had no telephone or telegraph, and more recently with the secret network of coast watchers on the Northern Islands and along a long stretch of coastline. Praying that VID would be tuned to the emergency frequency, Father McGrath switched on the radio and sent his call sign followed by his message of warning. Quote, 8SE to VID, he called. I have an urgent message, stop. An unusually large air formation bearing down on us from the northwest, stop. Identity suspect, stop. Visibility not clear, stop. Over. He transmitted verbally, and at the AWA coastal station, the officer in charge, Lou Kernock, received the message and immediately replied, 8SE from VID, stop. Message received, stop. Stand by. He recorded the signal strength of McGrath's message as 4, which indicated, on a scale of 1 to 5, that the signal was good and strong. There was no possibility of ambiguity or of Kernock having misheard the message. He immediately followed the set procedure and telephoned RAAF operations in Darwin to pass on the message to the duty officer. It was 09:37 and the officer acknowledged receipt of the message. Kernock entered it meticulously in his log and returned to his radio. He had told Father McGrath to stand by while he passed on the warning, but the priest was doing no such thing. He had scarcely finished his transmission when, out of the sky, 6-0 fighters swooped down over the island and machine-gunned an American Beechcraft transport plane that was sitting on the ground nearby. It was completely destroyed. Father McGrath rushed to take cover, having already started a stampede by telling the Aborigines to get out of the mission village when the aircraft were first sighted. That was the noise which brought Brother Quinn from his bed. The Euro peons on Bathurst and on neighbouring Melville Islands had no doubts about the danger of their position. Any attempt at an invasion of Darwin by the Japanese would mean that a landing on the islands was an essential first step, and the undefended mission would be immediately overrun. Even a suspicion that the priest and brothers were operating a radio would result in their deaths and probably the execution of some of the Aborigines. As soon as the Zeros had gone, Father McGrath hurried back to the radio and tried to establish contact with Darwin, but the Japanese had jammed it, and neither he nor Lou Kernock, who was calling frantically from Darwin, could communicate. The jamming, almost certainly carried out by one of the aircraft carriers, was a normal tactical manoeuvre by the Japanese. The Japanese fighters had blasted a hole in the church roof at the mission, but the wireless was untouched, and now, fearing a return of the Zeros or an imminent landing, the missionaries worked feverishly to dismantle it and carry it deep into the heavily timbered bush to a secret location. They were helped by the 3 Americans from the Beechcraft who, although they had escaped injury, were now trapped on the island. When the wireless was set up again, they tried repeatedly to reach Darwin, but the frequency remained jammed until 5 o'clock that afternoon, Darwin time, by which time the Japanese fleet was well on the way back to its safety of its base in the Celebes. 5 days later, Brother Quinn was transferred to the mainland in an aircraft, sent to collect the Japanese prisoner, and Father McGrath crossed the 2-kilometre wide Apsley Strait to Melville Island, taking the radio with him. Meanwhile, the Japanese aircraft roared on towards Darwin, where a group of RAAF officers were leisurely debating whether Father McGrath's report was worth sounding an alarm for. At the Darwin post office, business was brisker than usual that morning, and people had even been waiting for the doors to open at 9 o'clock. There was an air of tenseness, as though everyone was expecting some disaster to befall them, which they tried to cover up by an exaggerated cheerfulness. Postmaster Hurtle Bald had been in Darwin since 1940 on his present appointment, although he had lived there before. He had volunteered to come back and had travelled north from Adelaide with his wife Alice and his daughter Iris, who was then 19. His son Peter had stayed at school in Adelaide and had planned to join the family in Darwin for Christmas 1941, but at the last minute the plane was requisitioned and he was unable to get there. It was a stroke of providence, because he would certainly have still been in Darwin on that February day and would almost certainly have perished. The 4 women working the manual switchboard were also having an extremely busy morning, with the board jammed with calls from the army and from people in the town. The fear of impending raid made many of the 1,000 or so civilians still left there anxious to ring their families and reassure them that they were all still safe and well. Commander Fuchida crossed the coast of Australia to the east of Darwin and flew inland before turning so that he could approach the town from the southeast. Minoru Genda had planned it this way so that the bombers would already be heading back to the carrier when the bombs fell. The RAAF officers were still discussing the possibility that they were not Japanese aircraft at all, but American P-40 Kitty Hawks returning to base. It was now 9:55 and still no alarm had sounded. On the harbour, in the town, at Army headquarters and at the RAAF base, men and women went unconcernedly about their business, unaware that they now had less than 5 minutes remaining. At the post office, several people stood in the doorway watching the sun glint on the silver aircraft that were approaching the town. Some smiled and said, "Thank God the Yanks have got here at last," suspecting nothing. After all, no alarm had sounded, and the aircraft were coming from the south, from the opposite direction from where they knew the Japanese were based. They were still staring at them when the first salvo of bombs dropped away, quote, like one big raindrop as the sun caught them, a flash and then nothing more, unquote, as someone described them. Seconds later, there was an explosion from the direction of the wharf, and simultaneously the sirens began to wail all over town. When the first bombs exploded, Telegraph Supervisor Archibald Halls was speaking in Morse to the Chief Transmission Engineer in Adelaide, Frank O'Grady. Darwin was the point at which overseas cables arrived in Australia to be sent on their way to Adelaide and the Australian grid. Halls hurriedly broke off his conversation with the words, quote, "Sec, there's another air raid alarm. I'll see you shortly," but he never did. With several others, he hurried out to the postmaster's garden adjoining the post office itself, where Hurtle Bald had built a large shelter. a hole in the ground covered with two halves of a corrugated iron water tank. Already crouching there were Bald and his wife and daughter, the four telephone operators, 35-year-old Frida Stasinowski, sisters Eileen and Jean Mullen, and Emily Young, the wife of a garage proprietor, and another office worker called Arthur Wellington. Only minutes before the raid, Iris Bald had come back from the library. Perhaps 2 minutes elapsed after the first bombs had struck the wharf and the harbour. The next wave of bombers concentrated on the post office complex and the nearby administrative offices, which included the administrator's residence and the police station. The 9 people huddled in Bald's shelter cannot have known what happened when it received a direct hit from a bomb. They were killed instantly as the shelter disintegrated, the force of the blast doing grotesque things to their bodies. Hurtle Bald was blown skywards and was left sitting in a horrifying posture high in the fork of a tree. Possibly 8 1,000-pound bombs fell in this small area of the town, which was a well-defined target for the Japanese pilots. One bomb carved a hole 7 metres deep and 13 metres in diameter out of solid rock. Reg Ratley, the telephone technician who had watched the convoy return the evening before, ran towards the Bald's shelter when the raid began, but he found there was no room and he left at once. It saved his life. For a few moments he walked around vaguely, not knowing where to go, and then he went back to the familiar surroundings of the exchange. Almost at once he was driven out of there by a stick of bombs that exploded outside the window, so he raced for the cliff, intending to jump over the edge and scramble down the face. But at that moment a bomb exploded behind him and lifted him bodily, depositing him roughly on the bottom of the cliff. He was knocked unconscious, but he survived the raid. The senior telegraph engineer, Harry Hawke, was in his office close to the postmaster's house, and he took cover in a slit trench only 5 metres away. He was counting his blessings when he glanced up and saw a stick of bombs that seemed to be falling straight towards him. He heard what he afterwards described graphically as, quote, a rushing of air like tearing linen, unquote, as the bombs came closer, and then they exploded. He had never imagined that a bomb could strike with such force. The nearest one exploded only 30 metres away, and for what seemed like eternity, the whole area went black as night before the flying debris and dust settled. In the magistrates' court, lawyer Richard Ward was making an address for leniency on behalf of Patrick Murray, who had been charged with keeping a common gaming house. The court normally sat at 10 o'clock, but stipendiary magistrate C.K. Ward, bracket no kin of Richard Ward's, close bracket, had started the day's hearings by a clock that was 12 minutes fast. Richard Ward spoke briefly and had just glanced up at the clock when the first bomb exploded near the harbour. It showed 9:55. Magistrate Ward hurriedly adjourned the court, and lawyers and staff ran to slit trenches that had been dug at the rear of the courthouse. Another lawyer, who was to play a prominent part in the life of Darwin in the coming weeks, was in the back garden of his house on the esplanade. Like many others in Darwin that morning, Mr. Justice Wells, the sole Supreme Court judge in the Northern Territory, at first thought that the aircraft he saw approaching over the tall trees in his neighbour's garden were American, but he was puzzled by their formation, which he had never seen American aircraft using. At first, Judge Wells only saw the first flight of 9 level bombers. They were flying in a V formation. But as the second and third lines came into view, he knew immediately that this was the attack they had been expecting so long. The next moment, to confirm his worst fears, a nearby battery of anti-aircraft guns opened up and the first bombs exploded somewhere in the town. He was certain that no alarm was sounded. Quite by coincidence, there was in town that morning one of Australia's most distinguished airmen, Air Marshal Richard Williams, who almost single-handedly had formed the RAAF, was in transit from London. He had been due to fly out that morning by Empire flying boat, but the previous evening a light aircraft had arrived with the news that Townsville, Williams's next stop, was in the throes of a cyclone. Arrangements were being hurriedly made to provide alternative transport to get him down to Melbourne, where he had an urgent appointment with the War Cabinet. Williams was waiting at the door of the Hotel Darwin for the senior staff officer from Area Command Headquarters, Group Captain Frederick Scherger, to pick him up in his car and take him out to the RAAF base. Suddenly he saw men running to their guns in an anti-aircraft emplacement nearby. There had been no siren nor any other warning, and Williams thought they must be practising. He wandered over and stood under some trees to watch them. He was still watching them when he heard one of the men cry out, "There they are," and he looked up to see 27 bombers coming into position to attack. He saw the first bomb leave the leader's bomb bay, glinting in the sun, and instinctively knew that it would fall over the harbour, well away from where he was standing. As the guns clattered, he stood his ground, carefully taking in all that he saw. The bombers wheeled away to the west to begin their second run, and this time he sensed danger, and he knew that the next salvos would be aimed for the town. He took cover and saw the bombs fall, as he expected, near the government offices. He was able to explain later how it was that the post office staff had taken cover when no alarm had been sounded. They had taken advantage of the 2 minutes that it took the bombers to circle round after attacking the harbour. I think we'll call a halt to the second movie now, so that I don't run out of memory chip or upload time. More will follow. Ciao.